dimostrato, che dimostrano anche la serietà delle analisi che vengono condotte, per aver sottolineato ancora una volta l'importanza della valutazione della gestione. Non è un contributo superficiale che si fa per moda, ma è sempre necessario confrontarsi, rendersi conto, migliorare, cercare anche di modificare una realtà molto complessa. La gestione non è facile, è stato sottolineato, però è una sfida necessaria, importante, e credo che il messaggio complessivo che emerge da questo suo contributo sia che comunque la realtà delle aree protette, al di là dei pregiudizi, non sia da interpretare come un peso, un vincolo, una sovrastruttura come da qualche parte si evince o potrebbe emergere, ma una vera risorsa da esplorare fino in fondo. Siamo anche noi partecipi di questa realtà internazionale e per concludere, diciamo, gli interventi della prima sessione di questa mattinata, inviterei il dottor Andras Krolopp a trattare l'argomento che era previsto, le aree protette, la conservazione della biodiversità, soprattutto in funzione del programma Countdown 2010, del quale la stampa ha parlato a più riprese. Ci sono molte organizzazioni ambientaliste italiane che all'interno di questo programma hanno fornito il loro contributo, Legambiente, Federparchi stessa, un po' diciamo la realtà del nostro ambientalismo. Tratterà di questo argomento, è di origine ungherese, vice segretario appunto di questo programma Countdown 2010, che è un traguardo importante per noi, entro il quale dovremmo essere riusciti in teoria, spero anche in realtà per tutti noi, per la nostra salute, per il nostro futuro, a invertire quel trend di arresto, diciamo, di continua perdita della biodiversità, che è uno dei problemi planetari più significativi. Si occupa, è responsabile della pianificazione strategica, ha diretto per 7 anni un sito CE Web, che è una rete internazionale di organizzazioni non governative impegnata nella conservazione della biodiversità attraverso la promozione dello sviluppo sostenibile. Avrete sentito sicuramente stamattina ricorrere spesso questo termine. C'è un linguaggio comune al di là delle nostre identità e questo fa bene sperare. Opera soprattutto nell'Europa centrale e orientale e ancora in precedenza era stato direttore regionale per l'Europa centrale ed orientale di un centro europeo per la conservazione della natura. Lo ringraziamo per la sua qualificata presenza.
Thank you very much for the long introduction, and thank you very much for the organizers allowing me to address you. And also thank you so much for the warm Italian hospitality I've been experiencing so far. For the sake of time, I try to speed up my presentation a little bit, and I would like to warn you already that unless the presentations before, I will try to look at nature conservation from more a policy angle. Because at the end of the day, we depend on quite a bit from the policy and decision makers high up. Right now what we are focusing, that is in Brussels. I'm working in the IUCN office that is based in Brussels, that is the IUCN office for Europe, and that is where we try to influence decision makers. But let me start diving into my presentation and tell you a story about Countdown, what is one of our best kept secrets. Funny short film, but what is the story what it tells us? Well, once there was nature and there were natural processes. At one point mankind came and intervened. Sometimes it is good because you all laughed and it was funny. Sometimes it is bad for a cheetah because he won't get the prey. But mankind intervenes in many ways, and we see that biodiversity is in decline. I don't need to tell you, because you are all aware of that we are facing serious problems. If we see, for example, the Living Planet Index produced by WWF, we do see that all the species, all the biomes are in serious decline. Because of that, there are quite a bit of noise made, mainly by non-governmental organizations, NGOs, but also by some governments and governmental officials who felt responsible. And the noise were generated so big that it reached to Brussels. And in 2001 in Gothenburg, during the Swedish presidency, the heads of states of the European Union agreed that, well, something needs to be done. Something needs to be done in order to protect biodiversity. So what should we do? Well, we should halt biodiversity loss, easy as it is. Well, it was in 2001, and possibly they took out their agendas, they paged around and they said that, well, 2010 seems to be still quite far away, there will be elections coming up, we don't know what is going to happen, so let's pick a date, 2010. By that time, in 9 years, we are going to halt biodiversity loss. That was the commitment. The policy machinery in Brussels doesn't work very fast, so it took quite some time, from 2001 to 2004, still under the Irish presidency. A big meeting was called together in Malahide, that was called the Malahide meeting, and then the message from Malahide, where both stakeholders and EU decision makers, but also heads of states from the European Union, gathered together and they agreed how this ambitious target, that had its name already, the 2010 target, should be achieved. Like many conferences, it also had quite some interesting outcomes. One of them, that the Countdown initiative itself was hosted, was launched among the European stakeholders. It also became part of the EU presidencies. It was suggested that each EU presidency, as they are passing the baton to each other, they will pick up a biodiversity target in the presidency agenda as well. It also identified a European strategy how to meet the 2010 target, and it did in 150 action items. And the Countdown initiative itself was endorsed by the ministers there, and IUCN at that time offered to host the Countdown Secretariat. Therefore, we are based at the IUCN office. A little bit of a time machine, what was happening since? Well, I mentioned before 2001 Gothenburg, the Countdown initiative, the Countdown target was decided. A year later, during the CBD COP, the Convention on Biological Diversity Conference of the Parties meeting in Den Haag, it was also taken up, and as such it was brought up to global level. 2003 in Kiev, the meeting of the environmental ministers of Europe, the so-called Environment for Europe process, reinforced the 2010 targets and said that yes, that is something that we have to implement in a pan-European setting. 2004, the EU came up with a Malahide message. Nairobi CMS also endorsed the Countdown initiative. 2006, the Countdown communication again by the EU was launched during the EU Green Week. 2007 saw the next Environment for Europe meeting in Belgrade, when the first assessment report was produced, how far we are progressing on achieving the target halting biodiversity loss. And 2008, Bonn is just finished, the last conference of the parties of the CBD, again reinforcing the 2010 targets and also raising some concerns if it is going to be met, particularly in focus of the plan of work on protected areas. So to summarize, there is a 2010 target on the European level by the EU presidencies, what says that biodiversity decline should be halted. But it was a European target. And globalization, what we love or we hate, but globalization kicked in, and maybe realistically, the CBD endorsed the 2010 target with a bit of modification that we are not halting biodiversity loss by 2010, but we are slowing down the rate of we are losing the species. What is somewhat weakening the target, but maybe that is somewhat more realistic to aim for. And as I mentioned before, it also found its place the CBD program of work on protected areas. Well, that was all the policy responses, but from policy to action, there's always a big gap, and we have to mind the gap. that we have to see that from policy discussions,